Hello, and welcome to Leaderfolk, an inclusive look inside the Jewish community. I'm your host, Sarah Bugamolny. Before we jump into our conversation today, it is imperative to mention the recent killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and George Floyd. These heartbreaking and repugnant examples of the pervasive racism in our country have sparked protests nationwide. And although Leaderfolk is not a news podcast, our mission to elevate and amplify the voices of marginalized leaders in the Jewish community and our obligation as Jews to seek justice and tikkun olam means that we have a responsibility to clearly and strongly stand by the Black community and to say out loud that Black lives matter. Jewfolk Inc., the organization which this podcast is a part of, put out a statement of intent of how we can do better. Part of that statement is to utilize our existing platforms to bring the voices and experiences of all Jews of color to those in our communities who might not encounter such voices in their daily routines. That, in part, is why today I'm so pleased to welcome Beckee Birger. She is the Program Director for Teen Leadership and Philanthropy for the Jewish Federation of Chicago and helped create the Jews of Color Caucus at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. Beckee, I'm so honored to have you on today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm really excited to join you.
So I think it's really important as we dive into a conversation with any guest to just know, who are you? Where are you from? How do you identify Jewishly or otherwise? And how did you end up where you are?
Yeah, right. Who are we in relationship to each other? So I live in Chicago. I am Skokie born and raised, so suburbs of Chicago. And, I love to tell the story that in many ways I am the most classically raised Jewish kid. I grew up in Federation programs. I was a Sunday school teacher. I went to overnight camp. And so my return to the Jewish community as a communal professional is really sort of like the story we all dream about of the kids that do Jewish programming as kids who come back to be leaders in the spaces. And I'm really lucky to be leading and working in ways that I get to be my full Jewish self.
Absolutely. And you, I think, had an interesting path, an unusual path to the Jewish communal professional life, coming through law school.
Yeah. So it was never my intention to be a Jewish communal professional. I went to law school to do special ed law and practiced for a little while helping students get special ed services around Illinois. And from there, I took a lot of education jobs. So I realized that my passion was using my law background to help people better understand civic life and especially help young people feel empowered in being engaged in social justice. And that led me through a lot of different paths at a bar foundation, at the University of Chicago. And I had a moment where I was sort of ready to do this work of justice education, and was lucky to find my current role at Chicago's Federation.
So how does justice education play out in this role as the Director for Teen Leadership and Philanthropy?
Yeah, I'm so lucky that I get to run two really, I think, incredible groundbreaking programs. So one of the programs I run is a Jewish foundation for teens, where they spend the year learning about philanthropy and doing all the hard work that adults do when they are on the board of a foundation to give away grants for work that they care about. And our teens this year they made grants of almost $50,000. The program to date has made grants of almost $700,000 over the history of what we've been doing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's super cool. And, it's a program I grew up in. So I run this program, but I was in one of the very first boards way back in high school, a long, long time ago. And the other program I run is a feminist research cohort for Jewish girls and non-binary teens that is a partnership with DePaul University that allows teens to look at social justice issues in the community around them and do research. And every year they put out a research report of what they're finding around social justice issues in the community. So this year they're looking at privileged and marginalized identities. In the past, they've looked at disordered eating, they've looked at rape culture, they've looked at the myth of the perfect Jewish girl, but letting these teens lead the conversation about what are the social justice issues we need to be thinking about as a Jewish community.
What kind of training goes into that kind of education? Because I know I'm a Jewish professional, but I feel like I kind of dodged some of that teen leadership development, and now I'm an adult who is engaged in the Jewish community, but doesn't always feel like I know enough to do a great job in some of those spheres, especially the philanthropic advocacy kind of spheres. So do you have any advice on any insight or advice on how to approach that, either from your experience within the program or just from interfacing with other Jewish professionals?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is it's never too late to learn, right? So the moment that you realize that there's any sort of skill gap in the work that you're doing, as a professional, you figure out how to fill that gap. And so maybe that's you don't actually know how to use Excel and you're taking courses around Excel, but maybe that's you don't have the equity training that you want, whether that's around racial equity or disability inclusion or LGBTQ inclusion, right? The list can go on, but the first is like recognizing a skills gap, and then it's about recognizing what are the local organizations, what are the national organizations that can help fill that gap. You know, there are so many incredible organizations that are doing work hyper locally and nationally, and starting to get yourself familiar about what's going on and what the landscape is and where you can plug in for that training.
In terms of the overall landscape in the Jewish community, how supported do you feel in this work? Like, how do you feel like the Jewish community is coming on this journey?
Sarah, that is the sort of biggest question, right? Is where are we as Jews in this moment? And to me in my work, it's really important to sort of name the systems as we see them. And so the question of how are Jews doing around racial equity in Jewish spaces is the big question of this moment. I feel really lucky to feel as though I'm inheriting a legacy of like other strong Black Jewish women who started this work a long, long time ago, right? There are folks like Alana Kaufman and Yabila McCoy and April Baskin and Rabbi Sandra Lawson, some of whom I know personally, some of whom I just follow their work. But there's a long history of people doing their best to really create racially conscious Jewish spaces. And in my work, I inherit space because of the work that they've done. And we still have a long, long way to go. You know, I'm sure many of the people who are listening to this podcast don't know all of those women, despite the incredible work that they have done and are currently doing to bring racial equity to the forefront of Jewish conversation. So we've started the conversation, and we've got a long, long way to go until we're really in a place where folks get to start feeling comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more specifically, kind of bouncing back a moment to what you were talking about, this research that the young people are doing in your community, and how you kind of introduce this framework to them and how you bring them into feeling like the Jewish community is their space to build upon and not just something that is kind of set in stone and prescribed.
Yeah, so the first third of our year is doing foundational education around around social justice topics and giving them the language to be a part of bigger national conversations. So we talk about power, privilege, oppression. We do a really college level critical theory course. And then we bring in speakers to talk about all of the different granular issues. So we bring in someone from Keshet, the LGBTQ Jewish organization, to talk to them about, what is the history of queerness in America, and what are their roles as allies to that community. We have a whole session around race and racism and how to be good anti-racist allies. We do a whole session on feminism and the complicated history of feminism and the feminist movement. And we spend a couple months really digging in and giving them the language to feel comfortable showing up as leaders, and giving them that tool of knowledge and language to then start asking those big questions.
I am so grateful and impressed that you have been given this space within the kind of foundational organizational structure of the Jewish community to take such an activist stance and to be able to provide this like really crucial education.
Yeah, it's neat. I feel really lucky to be in a space where I can say that the Federation in Chicago cares that the teens who want to have these sort of conversations have a space to have them with a Jewish lens.
Yeah. So I hear obviously like your work with the teens is incredibly important. I would love for you to tell us more about the Jews of Color Caucus at the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs that I mentioned at the top of the episode.
So the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, JCUA, is a Jewish community organizing organization in Chicago. And I got involved in 2015, 2016, really just looking to sort of do justice work Jewishly. I am famous for saying that sort of my understanding of what Judaism is deeply tied to my understanding of what justice is, and that I can't be Jewish without justice work. And so I was really excited to find a home that allowed me to do justice work Jewishly. And through my work there are lots of other Jews of color in that space. And four Black Jewish women decided that we needed a space where we could start to talk about racism in the Jewish community, but also just be our fullest selves. I think there's often a moment when we talk about race that we are always talking about racism. And part of the work that we do is also just creating space for Jews of color to come together, to celebrate, to be joyous, to hold space with each other, to have spaces that fully acknowledge our identities as Jews and as people of color without having to choose one or the other. So we came together and created that caucus about 2 years ago. And to JCUA's credit, they saw the work that they were doing. They did the thing that is most important for any organization. They put resources behind it. They put money behind it. They hired a staff person, a Black Jewish woman, to be on staff to help us run this caucus and to do other work. Her job is not just Jew of color work, but they gave us the resources to build and to grow.
That's really incredible. So what has it grown into since it began?
Like I said, it started out as four of us in the library of a congregation on the South Side, sort of taking the space where we could find it and plotting and scheming. And we've grown membership. I'm excited every time a new person shows up. every year we hold a Juneteenth Seder, modeled off of the beautiful Juneteenth Seders that other Jewish organizations have done. Juneteenth, for people that don't know, is the holiday that marks the last enslaved Black folks learning that they were free in the United States. So every year we hold a Juneteenth Seder. We're having our third one in like 2 weekends. We help lead racial justice trainings for white people in our organization. On Saturday, we are hosting a pre-rally Black Jews for Black Lives Jewish gathering to center our work in the important organizing that's happening. So, all the work that JCUA is doing, we're plugged in and really trying to bring folks into the organizing work and to the cultural organizing of Jews of Color.
I would love, based on your comment about, I think you said it's coming up on Saturday, this Black Jews for Black Lives, I'd love if we could kind of zoom in to the events of the past week and a half. And I would love to just give you the opportunity to speak about what might be on your mind as these horrible events have unfolded over the past couple of weeks.
Yeah. I think the first piece is really a framing that the national conversation around anti-Black racism, especially around policing and police brutality, has been brought to the forefront in the last week or so, but that it has existed for as long as the United States has existed. I, through JCUA, have been doing police accountability organizing here in Chicago for 2 or 3 years. This is not a conversation that I started to have a week ago, 2 weeks ago. This is a conversation that I personally have been having my whole life, and that I've been doing active work in the Jewish community now for years. And so I think the first place to start, right, is the frame that this is something isolated that has happened in the last couple of weeks, but rather it is a culmination of incredible Black organizing, Jewish and non-Jewish, to really bring the cultural moment along for folks to finally feel like this is everybody's fight, and that police brutality is something that we should all care about, and not just Black people begging and fighting and organizing and pushing.
Thank you. Yes, I think that is a really, really necessary reminder that it isn't new at all. And I've seen so much floating around the internet and in conversations, especially in white spaces over the past week and a half, that includes some sort of sentiment of shock or bewilderment. And you're absolutely right, of course, that the pervasive history of racism in this country dates back hundreds of years, and the brutality and the discrimination is not new to the Black communities who experience it every day. And this also isn't the first time that we've seen protests against it. Of course not. People have not been taking this quietly, and people have been speaking up on the right side of racial equality and racial justice for a long time. Am I right in feeling that there's something different this time?
Yeah, there is something different this time. And I think that there will be, who knows when this moment will happen, but there's going to be, right, this whole wave of think pieces of like, why was this moment different? Why do I think this moment is different? I think that there has been a lot of hard organizing by Black folks, Jewish and non-Jewish, to shift the conversation, and to have this conversation over and over every time it happens. And every time we have this conversation around policing, I think people listen a little more and a little more. I think that we are in a moment where the current political climate has woken a lot of people up to start to do some of their own learning in a way that didn't feel necessary to white people before this. I think a lot of white people have done a lot of their own racial justice learning in the last couple of years. And I think that there are probably folks that are smarter than me that have deeper insights into like what has made this moment feel so critical. I think probably COVID is another piece, and the ways in which this pandemic is really ravaging Black and brown communities, and people taking life more seriously in general in this moment, as we've sort of nationally been reckoning with a couple of months of how precious life in general is, and laying some of this systemic issues really bare around this pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. I think that you're right. I just want to call myself out for a quick moment and just say that this is a really difficult conversation to have, and I'm just grateful to be having it and to have you here with me, because I have felt very called in this week to do a lot of learning, and it's not about me at all, but I'm trying, and I know that you even being here in the first place is such an honor and such a gift.
Thanks. One thing that feels really important for me, for the Jewish community to be thinking about, is what are the ways that this is the beginning of a lifetime's worth of work to fix issues within our community and to talk about racial equity in the Jewish community. And what I mean by that is twofold. So one is, how do we make sure that in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years, 10 years, people are still talking about anti-Black racism, racism in general, police brutality, other systems of oppression? How do we make sure that this isn't this isn't a fluke moment? And what are folks doing to put themselves in positions to be doing this work for the rest of their lives? And I think the other thing that's important for the Jewish community to think about is, how are we doing the internal work within our organizations? So how are we making sure that our organizations are showing up as anti-racist and welcoming for folks who just want to go to shul, for folks who just want to show up at a Seder, for folks who just want to make sure that they, can access all of the incredible pieces of Jewish life that we've created? How are we doing that work too? The work that's quiet, the work that's internal, the work that means that our community is anti-racist in the ways that Black folk and other Jews of color get to feel like they can show up as fully themselves.
Are you seeing progress towards that, either in your communities or in others that you'd like to raise up?
Yeah, I think that I am the most excited for the progress that is to come. I think, I'm locally this year, I held a meetup just for Jewish teens of color in Chicago. And to my knowledge, nothing like that had ever been done under Federation's purviews. I got to do it as a part of my job. And it was a really beautiful and meaningful step forward. I got to create the space that I would have benefited from when I was in high school. And it was a really beautiful moment in my work that the Federation at Chicago let me do. Because I think that there is an increased understanding that there's a need for thinking about Jews of color. I think that JCUA has done an incredible job really digging in at a foundational level of how are they making sure that their internal commitment to anti-racism is just as strong as their external commitment to anti-racism. And I think that there are lots of organizations around the country that are starting to ask the right questions.
Of course, we hear lots of stuff internally within the Jewish community about how Jews of color or other, intersectionally marginalized populations of Jews are slow to affiliate and are slow to engage in the ways that the Jewish community typically defines engagement. But it does circle back to the root cause of those spaces not being created with inclusion and equity and justice in mind. And that's definitely something that I would like to keep an eye on moving forward. And I'm curious, what are some steps that other Jewish leaders can take to help create those spaces for the people who might just want to show up for a Seder or go to shul?
So I think that we could spend the rest of our lives talking about that piece. But I think, there's two pieces. One is assume everyone who shows up at your program is there because they want to be there. Every Jew of color I know has a horror story of being mistaken for a security guard, a cleaning person, a server, in the ways that white Jewish people don't have that experience because we're making assumptions about who is in our spaces. Train people in deep racial justice, train your staff to be good racial justice advocates, because the other truth of the matter is, even with training, even when you're doing deep work, people are going to mess up and they're going to do racist things. And some of it is going to be about what is the way that you respond that helps Jews of color feel supported when you do something racist in your space. How do you make up for it? How do you move forward? How do you make sure it doesn't happen a second time? So it's about learning and growing and really making sure that you're, like I said earlier, you have a long-term commitment to making racially equitable Jewish spaces.
Yes. Is there anything else in your work or your Jewish life that you wish that I had asked you to share about?
I think the other piece, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the other piece of racial equity and racial justice in the community is really about joy and creating authentically spaces where people get to be authentically themselves. And it's not just about making sure that all of the white people in your organization have racial justice training or have sensitivity training or whatever you want to call it. It's also about letting Jews of color lead and dream and create the spaces that we want to see without a frame of needing to fit into understandings of white American Judaism. How do we get to be leaders and create spaces that are beautiful and joyful and really push us towards the incredible work that we could all be doing if we could move past racism? And so it's not just about doing anti-racist work. That's important. It's also about envisioning the world as it could be and making space for folks to dream and envision and lead.
Thank you for that. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what that might look like, as soon as possible.
Right. Me too deeply.
Yeah. Well, Beckee, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that it's been a difficult week and a half in the middle of a difficult spring, and your wisdom and your expertise and your experience is so valuable, not only for my own learning, but I'm so honored to be able to provide our listeners a connection with you and your work as well. And just thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Leaderfolk is all about elevating voices and starting conversations. So now we'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@tcjewfolk.com to share your thoughts, your ideas, or to nominate future guests. Leaderfolk is a project of Jewfolk Inc. and the Jewfolk Podcast Network. For more information, visit tcjewfolk.com/podcast.